Welcome to ESGX Live, the community for information and education to inspire collaboration and we hope action to create a more resilient and more inclusive economy and society, with me, Nigel Lake, here in New York, and my co-host Paul Herman in San Francisco. First, a very good morning to everyone who's joining us in the Asia Pacific region. Good afternoon, or rather good evening to those in Africa and Europe, and good afternoon to everyone here in the Americas with us. Today, we're talking about resilient cities and funding adaptation to sea level rise in particular. And just by way of very brief introduction, I thought I'd share a couple of perspectives around some of these issues. So we probably all remember that the year began with some of the worst bushfires or wildfires that have been seen in Australia for a number of decades. This graphic here from The Guardian shows the amount of land burned overlaid on the northeastern part of the United States. It's almost unfathomable to imagine just how large that is. We've also seen significant fires in Siberia, and this is a graphic from NASA showing how, and just those fires turning into smoke over a huge area. It's difficult to get a scale from here. More recently, we have had news that May was the hottest May on record. Of course, we've had these sorts of things time and time again, so perhaps we're becoming blasé to them, but it's very likely that this year will be one of the 7 warmest years on record, and that means the 7 last years are all the 7 warmest years there have been since records began 140 years ago. One way of looking at this that I find quite helpful, just to make it very telling, is to look at the Arctic ice melt. And this is the data for the 20th of July. So that's yesterday if you're here in the Americas, and it's the day before if you were from Australia, for example. And you can see there's a very clear downward trend. There's no surprises here. But for me, that always just brings to life that these figures go on getting lower and lower and lower. And of course, the Arctic extent on this particular day is now below 7 million, which is a third lower than it was, when I started my career. All of this translates into sea level rise, as we know, and of course that creates significant challenges, and none of this is a future challenge. It's very much a today challenge. New York, as one example, has already announced a massive program of investment to focus on building the resilience of the city, and of course the C40 cities program around the world flags up a whole series of cities, literally hundreds, that are going to be impacted by sea level rise of up to 0.5 meter by 2050. I'll just move my head out of the way there. So with that, by way of introduction, I will hand over very shortly to Paul Herman to give some more introduction to what we're going to talk about and share some of the work that he's been doing at Hip Investor around these issues. Just a reminder, please do say hello to each other, introduce yourselves in the chat, join the discussion there. Please, if you've got resources you think are useful or comments you want to make, please do. We will look at them, and all our guests will be looking at them too. And if you have questions, if you ask them in the Q&A function, it's easier for us to keep track of them, and we will do our level best to answer them. And if you're watching on YouTube, please do hit the like button. It means more people will hear our guests' messages, which we really appreciate. So, Paul, I will hand over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Nigel, and welcome everybody to ESGX and a focus on resilient cities. Thanks very much, Lucia Pullman, David Godshall, Kristen Baja, and Kate Boicourt for joining us. Just want to introduce you to a new report published just today on the Urban Sustainability Directors Network site, or USDN. At usdn.org, you can find many public open source reports that focus on how cities are pursuing sustainability, taking climate action, and also how to fund and finance that climate action. So today's report that's being released is a collaboration among USDN, the city of Oakland as the lead city, and cities of Anchorage, Bend, Oregon, Columbia, Missouri, Fremont, San Luis Obispo, and of course, Oakland, California. And the focus of this report, which was co-authored by Lucia, who's on the line, Nick Gower, our producer, and Adam Mason, is how what funding and financing option process can be used in supporting a climate action plan. And that complements our 2016 report, where we laid out a mix of taxes, fees, debt, equity, grants, and partnerships. So on the right-hand side of this chart, you see energy and buildings, as well as transportation. Those are the big three. Those are the big producers of carbon emissions, but they're not alone. There's waste, there's also natural areas, and that'll be the focus today of not only how buildings and transportation and energy can be more resilient, but what defenses or offenses should we put in place to become more resilient with regard to sea level rise and climate changes. So on the next slide, what you can see is this is the 7-step process that any climate action planner can take, especially in the cities. USDN has a network of more than 200 cities across the US and Canada. These can be used globally in Asia, Australia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas, both South and North. On the next slide, what you'll see is a subset of potential financing mechanisms. And what's interesting and unique for cities is, while David today will talk about some unique ways of applying debt and muni bonds, including those that can be results-based, there are public-private partnerships, multi-sector partnerships, equity funds, debt funds that can be used for financing and funding resilience and climate action. Finally, on the last slide here, here's an example, which you'll read in the report, and Nick will put the link to the report in the chat box, which he's done right now. Thanks, Nick. And this is an example from one of the cities matching the climate action categories: energy, transport, buildings, waste, natural resources, and healthcare is sometimes part of a climate action plan of a city, mapping those to categories of debt, equity, partnerships, taxes, fees, and other financings. Exact funders, who are potential examples, potential vehicles, financing instruments and vehicles. And finally, a case study. And so what Lucia, Nick, Adam, and the team with the cities have done is show you that these are already done, that if a CFO or a treasurer of a city says, oh no, we can't do that, they can click on this link to see that. So please go download the report at usdn.org. The link is in the chat box. Take a scan through, take a deep read through. Happy to answer questions about it. So we'll turn it over to our special guests and Lucia Pullman, climate finance strategist. Over to you, Lucia.
Hi, everyone. Welcome again to ESGX Live Resilient Cities. My name is Lucia Pullman, and I'm a climate finance strategist, and I'll be your guest host for the next hour. Today, we'll be talking about what choices cities can make to become more resilient to rising seas. Specifically, we're going to be talking about what trade-offs exist between gray infrastructure and green infrastructure and behavioral adaptations, and the different funding landscapes that are aligned with each of these solutions. We'll also be talking about the intersectional nature of climate resilience and the importance of centering equity and holistic community wellness and how we adapt. To start, we'll have our 3 guest panelists introduce themselves and the work that they're leading across the United States. We'll begin with Kate Boicourt, who is the Director of Resilience at the Waterfront Alliance in New York City. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you, Lucia, for having me. And I have to say that I have the pleasure of having worked with Lucia in her previous role in building consensus on a number of the policies that I'm really focused on today. So just thanks to HIP and everybody for having me, and thanks to Lucia. I know she does great work, so I can't wait to read that report. Just quickly, who we are, what we do. Waterfront Alliance is a nonprofit 501c3 based in the New York City metropolitan region. I'm going to speak specifically to a campaign that we have launched with over 90 coalition partners, from grassroots organizations to businesses. I think it may be the first kind of its kind in the nation, fighting for climate adaptation. Quickly about the problem, as we see it in our region, we have more than 1 million people in the floodplain today in the New York City region, and that is across the nation. 40% of our population is concentrated at the coast. Next slide. We also know that our government resources to deal with this problem are in debt. We have more than $20 billion in our national flood insurance program. So FEMA is starting out hindered with ability to invest in the problem. Next slide, please. And then, frankly, we know that if we invest now, it's a lot cheaper than the other way around. We had more than $317 billion in flood insurance claims in 1 year in 2017 alone. That's effectively the GDP of Ireland for you sort of globally focused folks. And if we invest now, it really saves you and I taxpayer money over time. So we need to really get to that place. Next slide. And we know that at the individual level that disasters especially hit those worst and frontline communities, communities of color, immigrant communities, and widen wealth gaps along racial lines. Next slide. But there are solutions. So the solutions that, as I mentioned, I've got a policy campaign that Waterfront Alliance is really convening and leading, but we work with many others at federal, state, and local levels. And what we're really trying to do is secure policies and investments that help us to step up and step back from sea level rise, depending on the context. So we have to deal with both the infrastructure that we have in place now and the situation, leading towards a better planning and policies and codes in the future. And as Nigel showed that slide of New York City, that is one piece of New York City's 520 miles of coastline, and it covers about a mile, and it's $10 billion. So there's real challenges, and we can't do the same thing everywhere. So just a couple snippets from the individual asset scale. We're looking at increasing the ability to do things like PACE financing, property assessed clean energy, building back better from the get-go using programs like LEED certification for the waterfronts. That's we have a program called WEDGE that does that. Battery Park City is another example in New York City where the area's land use allows it, the land ownership structure allows it to come together and finance a project using a bond. At the sort of neighborhood or community-wide scale, there's a few different federal resources for infrastructure funding that we're really targeting. One is the Water Resources Development Act, which funds the Army Corps of Engineers. FEMA has a new program that's a little bit more forward-thinking called the BRIC, Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program. And then lastly, we're looking at really innovative solutions at the state level in the same way that you might get a charge on your energy bill for building better, investing in infrastructure. We think that there should be such a insurance-based trust fund for funding resilience efforts at the state level. So those are just a snapshot of things, and I look forward to discussing with the group.
Great, thank you so much, Kate. Next, we're gonna introduce Baja, who's the Programs Director of Climate Resilience at the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, or USDN. Welcome, Kristen. Baja.
Thank you. So thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be part of this panel, and always really great to hear from you, Kate, about the amazing things that are happening. First, for me, I'd like to acknowledge my white skin and my white privilege as part of this panel, and also to also acknowledge the unceded land that I live on in Baltimore from the Piscataway people. So just to honor the indigenous peoples and the sort of disruption of complacency that we have in the colonial systems here. So wanted to mention that. USDN was already sort of introduced, but I am the program director for Urban Sustainability Directors Network and Climate Resilience. And we are a network of over 240 local government leaders focused on collaborating on innovative solutions around climate change and social equity. In the resilience space, our main focus is around to stop doing what hasn't been working, and instead to refocus away from the typical climate action categories and focus on human and ecosystem needs. So reframing resilience, getting out of the idea of bouncing back and instead thinking about a more comprehensive and holistic approach that puts resilience into 3 different modes. So sort of the everyday needs of communities and community members being met to enhance community adaptive capacity as part of our resilience building. So we're really focusing on non-traditional approaches, looking at existing power, thinking about power shifting away from government to community members and community-based organizations, and centering our work in equity, breaking down silos and really stopping the siloing of equity, resilience, and greenhouse gas emissions from each other, and instead working more at the nexus and having projects that have those social benefits and that are helping communities to thrive amidst our changing climate conditions. And not thinking about just one hazard. I know we're talking about sea level rise a lot today, but really thinking about multi-hazards and multi-solutions for several issues. So some of the short-term things that we're doing is resilience trainings, and they used to be very interactive pre-COVID. We're working on what those look like in this sort of COVID space, but a lot of intense trainings with our different stakeholder groups, making them more interactive. We have some games called the Game of Extremes, the Game of Floods, the Game of Heat that are really helping out with this. Shifting away from the idea of disaster shelters and things that open up just in the event of a disruption, and focusing more on year-round holistic community resilience through resilience hubs, and really looking at serving the community year-round. Also really looking at land use, building code changes, and flood code changes, and getting out of the idea of a traditional cost-benefit analysis and ensuring that we have social and environmental elements that are centered and prioritized as part of the work. So I'm working at a more comprehensive cost-benefit analysis. We're exploring a lot of different metrics for success and thinking about moving away from the idea of emissions reduction or different sort of categories of measuring in that space, and instead getting into what are the community benefits and how are those enhanced to improve resilience. And we're also trying to move away a bit from these coping solutions, which are a lot of things that we do being short-term, and instead of thinking, what are these long-term opportunities that we can take? So I can go into a lot more depth on a lot of examples. We're certainly talking about strategic migration, looking at the intersection of the green, blue, gray infrastructure, thinking about land acquisition and different public services as a way to do so. Lots of different financing mechanisms for all of them, but look forward to this panel and this discussion.
Thank you, Baja. Next up, we have David. David is doing a lot of interesting work on the financing side of things. He's the managing director and general counsel of Quantified Ventures. Welcome, David Gottschalk.
Thank you. It's great to be here to talk with you all today. I'm particularly pleased to be invited to sit in with such a group of experts. I don't bring that kind of expertise to this conversation. I'm more of a generalist. I am the managing director and general counsel at Quantified Ventures. I've spent my career in the public finance space, doing a lot of general work, but also in particular in affordable housing and community development. At Quantified Ventures, we have a number of practice areas. One of them specifically relevant to what we're talking about today, which is our urban and coastal resilience practice, where we focused a lot on stormwater. We have pioneered the environmental impact bond model that was deployed in Washington, D.C. and the city of Atlanta most recently. But we work in other spaces as well that we feel are complementary. We have an agriculture practice that is focused on regenerative agriculture and carbon sequestration. We have a forestry practice that is focused on, in addition to the carbon benefits, the rural economic development aspects. And we have a health practice that is increasingly integrated with the environmental work that we do, focused primarily on community area health and providing outcomes that will reduce spending in the medical system and produce more both savings and efficiencies. But a word on Quantified Ventures. I just talked about outcomes. Quantified Ventures is an outcome-based capital firm. And what we do in practice is to try to work with our government, corporate and nonprofit clients to create programmatic solutions and financing solutions that make those happen. And that's everything from green infrastructure in large cities that have significant stormwater problems to programs to pay farmers to deploy best management practices in the Midwest in order to improve downstream water quality. And while some of those programs aren't specifically relevant to a discussion of resilient cities and sea level rise, I hope to have the opportunity to touch on them as we go through this conversation, because I think that there are aspects or keystones that can really be extrapolated from those to apply to the broader conversation that we're having. So thank you, and I look forward to being part of the discussion.
Thanks, David. So to start, for people who aren't super familiar with resilience and how that applies to an urban context, I would love it if maybe each panelist could take on a brief explanation of what gray infrastructure, green infrastructure, and behavioral adaptation looks like, or manage retreat. So to start, I was hoping to put Kate on the spot to explain what green infrastructure is. Baja, if you could explain what behavioral changes are, and David, if you want to explain what gray infrastructure is, and you guys can all keep your video on and we'll be on Zoom together.
Sure, love being put on the spot. So yeah, I think green infrastructure really is a pretty broad category, but for me, I think it's something that has something living involved in it and has multiple benefits that I think Baja mentioned. There's a lot of different benefits from human health, well-being, habitat, as well as water management, flood management, heat, urban cooling, that a green infrastructure approach has, that maybe a gray infrastructure approach might not. But both of these solutions are really important, and I look forward to hearing David's explanation of gray infrastructure to kind of carry that forward.
Is that on me? So I love this question. And if you'll just permit me a little digression, I like it in particular because of my long history with the resilient cities issue. My father was a city planning professor for many years and was one of the early writers on resilient cities. And so my introduction with this was sitting at the dinner table with him as he would speak in lengthy paragraphs and lectures, as he was wont to do, about why resilience was such an important concept. And it was really born out of the 9/11 attacks. And it was the thinking that went on about how cities and communities respond to these major shocks. And it built on the tradition of hazard mitigation, which was around the notion of enhancing the resilience of physical systems. So seawalls, things like that we talk about, right? Stronger electrical systems, better health networks, that sort of thing. But the resilient city sort of went beyond that to capture the importance of the human communities and to recognize that these disasters that we suffer are both physical and social phenomena. That is, that they play out in the built environment and they play out in the lived environment. And so that any focus really on creating resilience has to include notions like equity and fostering the human capability to work together and to recover from these external shocks. So that little extra aside, the gray infrastructure is the built environment. I mean, it is the things that we rely upon to sustain life in our cities. It's our water systems, it's our sewer systems, it's our transportation networks, it's our power grids. You can go a little bit further and say it takes into account things like the health systems, the big assets that are necessary to produce employment. But the traditional view of infrastructure is it's the public stuff: roads, water, sewer, power, and communications. And hardening those or expanding those or changing those in order to respond to the threat of climate change and sea level rise has been a major focus, and it's a very expensive focus for what our cities have to do. But it's not the only one. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to Baja.
Yeah, thanks, David. I think, as David said, resilience is more comprehensive. systems-based. And I think a lot of the work that we've been doing for a long time in this space is focusing on infrastructure, is focusing on these gray solutions and the idea of controlling water. One of the things that I think we've been doing for a long time that's sort of faulty around that is ignoring sort of the trauma that people are experiencing of sort of everyday needs not being met, in addition to having these shocks on top of their stressors. And then also ignoring our sort of ecosystems and trying to control them. And what we're learning from those is that our hardened infrastructure solutions are creating more problems down the line, both for people and the environment. And so I think with resilience, we're thinking about this anticipating and accommodating and positively adapting. But I think the word that we leave out a lot is thriving amidst these changing climate conditions. And the only way to do that is really to work at the intersection of our solutions and the intersection of the social, economic, and environmental. And so it's not just behavior change, it's a lot of recognizing the reason people are in more vulnerable situations, the reason people are in more high risk situations. A lot of those are due to our racist policies and practices. And people have not been attended to for decades. And so being able to think about how we are addressing the human experience as part of our solutions is something we've left out for a long time that I think we have to stop doing.
Thank you. And I think just to get concrete about what that might look like, could you speak a little bit, Baja, to the resilience hubs?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. The idea with resilience hubs, they are actually one of our short-term solutions. I think probably they're not the best solution for everything, but acknowledging that we have a lot of people in harm's way in spaces that we already know are being impacted. The idea is to focus on comprehensive everyday solutions, focus on people's everyday needs, and then to be building sort of stronger community cohesion, connectivity, working on this sort of preparedness through a site that people already trust, that they go to, and that's meeting their everyday needs. It's focused on sort of 5 areas of resilience: programming and services, communications, operations, power systems, and the building. I will say the power systems in the building is where we tend to focus a lot, whereas those other 3 areas are the areas that we need to put more time and energy into. They're intended to not be necessarily government-owned facilities, but instead a place to shift power away from government into the hands of neighborhood members and community organizations who can help to meet those everyday needs that are identified by the community, and also get folks prepared for that sort of multi-hazard and multi-crisis space, including in the midst of a global pandemic.
Yeah, and Kate, I know that with the Resilience Task Force, a big part of the equity goals of the policies that were put forth were around empowering community decision-making about how different neighborhoods are going to adapt. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that, and also perhaps some solutions that communities are getting really excited about across New York City.
Yeah, and I think I'll actually start from just building off of Baja's comment. We organize with a number of essentially first response organizations that were born out of Hurricane Sandy. Now they're responding to COVID-19. A lot of the same individuals and communities are affected with both disasters. And so one of the things that we can do is sort of recognize, and after Sandy, Hurricane Sandy was a huge hurricane in New York City, and it really affected us terribly. And one of the things that we realized there is exactly what Baja is saying, like people are not getting basic needs met, and investing in social resilience as well as meeting those basic needs has really got to be the platform of that. So, I think we're 3 sort of highlights. One, we're trying to get our federal and state and local governments to invest more in advance in a lot of these community pre-disaster, disaster preparedness and education programs. That's something, as well as some of the sort of community resilience centers that really build those hubs for people to learn and come together and figure out solutions. They can also serve in adaptation planning to help be a center for those kinds of conversations to happen. Secondly, through HUD, we are advocating at the federal level for not only fixes to the 1 in 10 public housing developments that are in the floodplain across the nation, 17% in New York City, actually. But really thinking about shifting our policies so that we are carefully looking at where we can build more affordable density in transit connected communities, so that there are options down the line, because that a lot of those public housing developments and affordable housing are in areas that there's a question as to whether or not they're going to be underwater in the future. And then lastly, fighting those little fights of cost benefit analyses and how we make decisions at the core level or at FEMA. One 100K house is, 10 100K houses is equivalent to one $1 million house in a buyout program. So thinking about how we serve those who need resources most to make decisions, and really make decisions, because a lot of, as Raja said, these are not decisions. People end up in places because they don't have other options. So those are 3 examples, and I'll cede to David or Raja.
So I think one question that emerges for me hearing all of this is that there's intersectional resilient solutions. And I think across the board, people have been getting really excited about green infrastructure as a solution. David, given the work done in DC around stormwater, can you give just a high level update on how does green infrastructure play in with sea level rise, and what kind of solution is green infrastructure in the landscape?
Sure. So just a little bit of background on the DC deal, because that was the first environmental impact bond we did. The District of Columbia has a big combined sewer outflow problem, which means that in big rain events, the stormwater from the rain mixes in with the sanitary sewage. And if there's too much of it for the system, it ends up in the Potomac River and the Anacostia River. The District of Columbia was under a consent decree with the US Environmental Protection Agency to solve that. And their solution was a typical gray infrastructure solution, although a very innovative one, where they were going to dig these massive tunnels under the district to hold the extra water. As they started looking at this, it became apparent that the cost of this project, which was almost $3 billion, was going to have dramatic impacts on ratepayers, particularly the poorest ratepayers in the city, who couldn't really be expected to carry the burden of dealing with this massive stormwater problem. So they got creative and started looking at sort of a holistic approach to the stormwater issue in the city, and determined that they could divert a lot of rainfall from the stormwater system by building green infrastructure. Bioretention, permeable pavement, bioswales, we have some pictures there. And so they set out to install a number of these sites in the District of Columbia with the notion of reducing the spend on the gray tunnels under the city, which has been pointed out are incredibly expensive and no one appreciates because you never see them. The nice thing about green infrastructure is it can be a park. You can sit on the bench under the trees, right? This has community benefits that go beyond just dealing with the water. So they did a $25 million deal to build green infrastructure sufficient to take up, I think, like 1.5 inches over 250 acres or something like that, 1.5 inches of rainfall. And it's being tested. And how the bonds that they issued, the environmental impact bonds, perform depends on how successful the project is, with the notion that if it works really well and DC Water saves a ton of money on not having to build tunnels, they'll share a portion of that savings with investors. So some of the takeaways from that were green infrastructure can save money. It can create additional co-benefits to communities that you don't get from gray infrastructure, like parks, like improved shade, like recreation space. In turn, those can have public health benefits. In addition, the green infrastructure program that the district took on had a big employment component because these facilities have to be maintained. And you could hire different people to do this kind of work. And so they had a big local employment program to train people basically in the landscape maintenance work that's necessary to care for all these new green infrastructure sites. So it created new employment in the very neighborhoods that were being touched. And lastly, one of the important things about it is it can be changed. A tunnel is fixed, right? It should last 50 or 100 years. It has a fixed capacity. If you want to change that, you have to spend a lot more money. Green infrastructure can evolve. If the plants aren't performing as well, you can swap in new plants. You can change the grading. There are a lot of things that can be done on an ongoing basis to enhance the capacity and function of the project that you just don't get with gray infrastructure.
And I have a question. What kind of metrics is the bond in DC measuring beyond reduced stormwater? Are there ways that the financial industry is starting to measure and reward for co-benefits that include community well-being, health impacts, et cetera?
It's an excellent question. And that's exactly the kind of stuff we're working on. We are doing another project now with the city of Hampton, Virginia. We may have some graphics on that too. Hampton has a major flooding problem because their seas are rising, their land is subsiding, and it's raining more. And so they've done one of the Dutch dialogues that people may have heard about, where experts from the Netherlands are coming over and doing a sort of living with water planning process with the city to try to figure out how they address that. And so they are looking at metrics with an upcoming bond issuance that include not only stormwater capture, but for example, public safety enhancements. There are a number of neighborhoods, particularly low-income neighborhoods, that are repeatedly flooded to the extent that they have a line item in their budget set aside to rescue people from those communities. So some of the tracking we've been talking about has been, can we track that spending? Are there major cost avoidance opportunities strictly from their public safety budget alone? Can we enhance evacuation routes in the event of major storms? Things like that.
Really interesting. And I think this ties in with Katie Blue's question, which is she's interested in how we can market green infrastructure in affected cities and how do we get people to understand the importance of them? Because clearly, as David has just explained, there's a lot of co-benefits to green infrastructure that can help cities become more resilient to sea level rise, but also accomplish a lot of other important goals for their residents. So I'm curious, Kate or Baja, what are your thoughts on how we can elevate the role of green infrastructure in responding to sea level rise?
I'm happy to jump in, but so I think that it's very challenging to put values on these things. I've seen some examples of cities which have done sort of an analysis of the different challenges that they have and really think about some of their goal setting in a very intersectional way. So I think, like a lot of the panelists have been talking about, really connecting goals to reduce urban heat, to also increase well-being and health, and look at all of these different metrics that we are trying to hit together. I think that is something that New York City has actually done well in its One Resiliency Plan, or really tried to do, is try to bring a lot of different metrics together, from equity to flood and climate and heat resilience to meeting our carbon goals, greenhouse gas reduction goals, and trying to think about where we can have those win-wins. So I think having some ability to quantify that is helpful, but also just in your planning and goal setting, really thinking about these things together.
Yeah, I have a very similar response to Kate, that I think it's more of looking at this as a multi-hazard and multi-solution approach. Green infrastructure is something that has benefits across equity, resilience, and greenhouse gas emissions, as long as we're thinking about it in relation to heat, in relation to precipitation variability, in relation to, combined sewer overflow. So there are going to be these sort of cascading benefits that we don't do a good job of putting into a traditional benefit cost analysis, and we're not looking at timelines associated with them. And so when you see social and environmental benefits, they typically happen in a longer time period. A lot of people have been asking me recently, why aren't we planting trees right now to deal with COVID and high heat? And explaining to people that trees take a very long time to actually get to the point in which they have that sort of benefit. And so just acknowledging that in our timelines and in these cost benefit analyses and the way that we value projects, I think is really important. And then also a lot of the pilot projects that are conducted are done in private locations or on rooftops of government buildings or other locations, when we actually should be switching it to the community, guiding what are the things that they need, what are the experiences they've been having, and actually prioritizing them in our lower income communities. A lot of times it's going to be looking at these spaces for multi-use as well. Are there opportunities for urban agriculture? Are there opportunities for community managed open space for gathering and other sort of cultural relevance? So just acknowledging that there's a lot of things that are really hard to measure, as Kate said, but maybe we're using the wrong sort of measurement system and the wrong sort of metrics when we're identifying how to value these.
I want to build on that point, if I may, because we see that a lot in our work too. And the challenge is not only valuing it, but it's getting people to pay, because the payment systems are so siloed. The health payers may realize the benefits of increased urban shade, but getting them to part with money to make that happen can be a challenge.
I wanted to add one thing, Lucia, is because something Vaja mentioned made me think of it. It's actually a neighbor of yours, Vaja. If you're in Baltimore, my friend Mateus is this guy that goes in guerrilla gardens all over Baltimore. And one thing that he's had trouble with, and I've heard about this from others, and it is a funding and finance question, because it's we don't make it easy for good things to be done well. So I think a lot of times in our policies from DOTs across the country at federal, state, and local levels, and that's changing, hopefully, there are things that we codify that are just easier to do. And so we need to make it easy, both so that, it's cheaper, but also just done more regularly as part of, city practice.
Yeah, and I think that brings us to Morgan Richmonds' question, which is asking on the ground, what knowledge or support would be most helpful for folks to access finance for these projects? So people who are implementing, what do you feel like they're needing regarding financing solutions? I'm curious, Baja, because you work with so many cities across the United States. What kind of financing or funding strategizing or support is USDN offering? And do you feel like cities really need right now?
Yeah, so I won't claim to know for all of our cities. For folks that are working in resilience right now, we are actually doing a funding and financing for resilience project series, and we're working with Joyce Coffey to go into the basics on just working in city government, understanding your capital improvement projects, understanding your revenue generating departments and your sort of public finance options, and then getting to know better private finance, thinking about capital markets and bonds, investments, loans, different opportunities that people have to work at these intersections. We've used David's project a couple times as examples of great things with DC. But we're also trying to make the case for our CFOs, and that is tying back into this sort of Government Finance Officers Association and the 4 elements that they really look at regarding reporting, analyzing projects, looking at the negative and positive effects, and the proactive cost savings and life-saving elements. And that's why we've been shifting into beyond the education into this comprehensive benefit cost sort of structure, because we still are using traditional CBAs for a lot of our capital improvement budgets, or when we're working with other pilot projects, we're working to shift away from that approach and provide the structure and also some of the numbers that are really hard to quantify, so folks are able to move things forward. I think the difficulty when you ask about the challenge is the folks who are working in government on these projects are not always the ones who are the decision makers. And often we need to get our politicians to understand that they're making a decision for something when they're not going to be in office. And that's a really hard thing. So we have to be working an inside-outside game where there's lots of different implementation partners. So if there's a problem in one area, we have other partners who are moving the project forward, and the funding isn't coming through one entity, that it's distributed in a way that still allows a project to move.
Yeah, and I think that ties into the work that HIP Investor and the impact investing industry is trying to do at large, which is expand the definition of value to include social and environmental value. HIP Investor has ratings on ESG and on climate resilience. And so I think the finance industry has a role to play so that city government officials don't have to make outlandish or unsubstantiated or do a bunch of work to try and quantify the benefit of things that we all know are the better solution in the long term. David, I'd love to turn the question that I just asked Baja to you and just ask what financial solutions do you think are really exciting right now? I know we talked a little bit about the bonds you've been working on, but I'm curious if there's anything else that has been coming up recently that you think the audience should really know about.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it's the financing needs of this problem are staggering. There's at least one calculation we heard earlier for $1 trillion worldwide, 400 billion for the U.S. just for sea level rise alone, and that's primarily for seawalls. And there's a lot more to it than that, obviously. So the bonding approach has been a big one, right? Because that's traditionally how cities raise money. And it's how they will continue to raise money. It can be challenging because of the many demands that they're placed under now, particularly with the pandemic, with some of the economic issues that are rising out of that, affecting tax bases, et cetera. We don't need to go into all that now. But it's hard for cities to borrow the kind of money that they need in order to solve these problems. There has to be a private sector role in creating some of these solutions. I think simply because, at least at the state and local level, you're going to start running into debt capacity constraints. So I had mentioned earlier in passing our regenerative agriculture work, and in that we've got a pilot that we're running now in Iowa with the Iowa Soybean Association to pay farmers to change their on-field practices in a way that improves downstream water quality. This is a really important issue in the Midwest. It's not sea level rise, but the excess nutrient runoffs create these tremendous algal blooms in the Great Lakes and elsewhere that's impacting people's drinking water. So what we have found is that there actually is kind of a market-based solution for local governments to invest in water quality outcomes, and for big corporations, primarily agribusinesses so far, to invest in the carbon sequestration to meet their own internal sustainability goals. We've only got about 10,000 acres under cultivation like this now. The goal is to be at 100,000 within 2 years. And ideally, it's a program that can be rolled out not just in the Midwest or the US, but is going to have international applications as well. We're working on a similar project in the north of the UK at this point, where their issues are both water quality, but also flooding, downstream flooding. So, I mean, my personal opinion is we've got to start finding opportunities like that at the state and local level around sea level, or we're just not going to be able to tackle it. The other thing I think that's got promise is along the line of sort of the old Robert Moses authorities in New York, where they took a tolling approach. And we may have to start creating tolling or taxing systems specifically to fund sea level responses for a lot of these coastal communities. And that's going to be difficult, but I don't see how you get around it.
It's actually a really interesting example in San Francisco where they're looking at driver's license fees to fund seawalls. So that's just to touch on what David just said.
Really
I hadn't heard that, but that's really good. Yeah.
And we have another question from the audience from Jerry Strub, who asks, have there been any studies that evaluate sustainability investment options to determine what are the most efficient use of government funds? So maybe a long-term study about the co-benefit impacts, comparing gray-green and behavioral change or retreat. Do those kind of studies exist? Is anyone working on them?
I know there's a lot of academic partners working on a lot of these type of studies and bringing things together where they are maybe doing so from a different perspective than what might local government structured or what community-based orgs might. I think there are lots of different things happening sort of simultaneously to try to quantify different benefits from sustainability, climate action, equity action. I can't say off the top of my head to point to like, this is the one that I always go to, but I do know that there are a lot of folks that are interested in it and that we have a lot of academic partners who sort of reach out to USDN on a weekly basis to make those connections.
Another question we have is from Bruce Patton, who's interested in how we can plan intelligently at the city scale to predict and prepare for resilience challenges. And to start off answering this question, I'm gonna steal an anecdote that I actually learned when I was working with Kate, which is in the New York City metro region, New Jersey and New York are actually using different projections for sea level rise, even though they share a river. So the ability to plan from a top-down level, so everyone's on the same page and understanding what risks are coming their way at the same time that we're empowering bottom-up solutions is really important. But I'd love, Kate, if you can talk a little bit about how the policy platform that you're developing is thinking about city scale solutions and regional solutions.
Yeah, and thank you for that anecdote. That actually reminds me of a conversation we've had about, you know, people, especially in big metropolitan regions, don't live just in neighborhoods and like work in another place. They live sort of regionally often and work regionally, where they're commuting from one place to another. They're moving around a metropolitan region, and the New York City Office of City Planning has recognized this, and they do have actually a geography of jobs report through their regional planning office. So there's a regional planning office within New York City Planning, which is really brilliant that they have that. So they've looked at actually migration and demographics projections over time based on job growth, density growth, affordability, and a lot of different issues in the New York, New Jersey region. So to Lucia's point, I think one of the things that we're proposing both at the city scale in New York City is to have a comprehensive resilience plan or strategy that is really based in a real two-way conversation with communities, because every community is going to have a different trajectory, different options, different feasibilities, and different community desires, but also to have essentially a regional forum for that, and thinking about how the geography of jobs report, for example, would look like overlaid with sea level rise. Where are people going to be able to live functionally over time? And those are tremendously hard and political conversations for any elected official to have, because there's a lot of community decision making that needs to happen, while simultaneously there's a lot of transparency about the fact that Coney Island, Rockaway, Broad Channel, parts of Newark, parts of Elizabeth. These are places that we're facing inundation of entire communities or areas over time. There are some options there. Some of them are very expensive. Some of them are feasible, some are not. And it's just something we're trying to do, is actually educate our elected leaders and future elected leaders about how to talk about climate resilience and fighting for that comprehensive plan and a regional resilience council.
Thank you, Kate. So we're actually very close to the top of the hour. So I'm going to ask one final lightning round, quick one sentence answer question. And then I'm going to pass it back to Paul and Nigel to wrap us up. So my question is, for folks who may not be as engaged in this work already, maybe they're really concerned about the threat of rising seas, but they haven't yet gotten deeply involved yet. What's one place in their local community that you think would be a good place for them to Google, see if they can help out? Maybe it's political, maybe it's community oriented, but to give some ideas, some like human scale solutions, how they can be a part of just adaptation. And popcorn, whoever's ready can go first.
I think if folks are working in their own communities and thinking about their own communities, think about their own neighborhoods. There's a lot of local community-based organizations and other groups. The issue is we have so much of a top-down approach, especially in this space. A lot of data and academic knowledge that I think kind of pushes a little bit heavier rather than bringing forward the voices, listening, hearing what people's needs are. If there's an opportunity to work in your neighborhood to bring together folks, start to have a collective message and to push for that message and push for those needs to be heard throughout every element of planning, document design, all these other things, I think that's going to have a huge impact.
Thank you.
I could not agree more. And a colleague and friend recently said, you know, a lot of people know about climate change, but a lot of people don't talk about it. So talking to your friends and family is one of the biggest things. And the one piece I will add to that is know your risk. I find Surging Seas, Climate Central, they have a great way to view what the risk is in your community. I think that's a helpful self-education that you can use when maybe you're joining community discussions or planning activities. So that's one thing.
I like all of those, and mine's not nearly as good, but I'm going to say it anyway, which is take a look at your bank accounts, your investment portfolio. Are you funding climate hostile activities? If so, make a change. There are great opportunities out there to invest for impact in ways that can help solve this problem locally, nationally, and globally. And it's an easy way to contribute, and you don't have to leave your home and talk to other people.
Thank you, David. And thank you so much for all of the panelists for your engaged and thoughtful discussion. I'm so happy that we were able to gather digitally today, and passing it to Nigel and Paul to wrap us up.
Nigel, you're on mute. All right, well, Nigel gets on mute.
Apologies, sorry, my microphone was hiding at the bottom of the screen there. Wow, so much to think about in there. I think that's been incredibly helpful and a really insightful set of ideas and experience and knowledge being shared. There are a few positive points I wanted to pick out. We always like to end with various bits of good news, and so here are a few of those. You know, one for me is that there has been an enormous amount about climate change action, which has been highly politicized. And one of the good things about the focus on cities is that this action can take place at a city level. The C40 initiative brings together 40 of the larger cities and is sharing resources and experience in a way that I think is very helpful. There's of course specific action being taken. New York is one city where there is a lot of work underway, and there are also resources being developed to support thinking about how to act on this. And the report which Paul flagged earlier on from USDN and HIP Investor Funding and Financing Climate Action Plans is a good example of that. Another point for me is that a lot of this can just be building nice things. The examples around the DC Water Initiative, where you have got green infrastructure being built, it improves the environment and it's more cost effective, is another. And I think that cost effective point is something which is incredibly important. Very often, any of these things are thought of as something which is going to be an imposition, more expensive. And it is great to see that there are examples where actually the cost-effective solution is a greener solution too, which I think is very encouraging. The development of various shared resources is a reminder that all of this is a team sport, and the resilience hubs was a very good example of that. And just one snippet I wanted to share as well in terms of ESGX itself. We now have people joining us from over 50 countries around the world, 55 at the last count. So there are all sorts of individuals in this community who may be able to help take action with projects that you're involved with yourself. So thank you for joining us. And finally, I wanted to flag just before handing over to Paul, we have covered all sorts of different topics over time. Here are just a few of the more recent ones. And so I was going to say now, if there are topics you think are particularly helpful, please do let us know, whether it's in the chat here today. You can simply send an email to info@esgx.org and we will receive that. And all ideas for topics and speakers very much gratefully received as we try to bring material to you which you find particularly helpful. So with that from me, I will hand over to Paul to talk about what we've got coming up.
Great, thank you, Nigel. And thanks again to Kate Boicourt from Waterfront Alliance, to Kristen Baja from the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, USDN, and to David Gottschalk of Quantified Ventures for all your leadership, wisdom, insight, and most of all, solutions. So next week on ESGX, it's our monthly green jobs report. So tune in to see if green jobs are more resilient or eroding faster. And spoiler alert, it's better to have green jobs than less green jobs. And we continue to dig in deeper about how those might be affecting high contact industries during COVID-19 and ideas for policymaking. So again, Dr. Fadil Kaboub, Dr. Scott Fulweiler, and Amir Khalegi will join us, and we'll have one more special guest to be announced shortly as soon as they confirm. So thanks again, Nick Gower, for producing us, Lucia Pullman for moderating and curating our conversation, and my co-host, Nigel Lake. Please feel free to share this. This is free, online, and global, so you can be educated, inspired, and take action. You can do that on social media and on YouTube. So on behalf of ESGX, I'm Paul Herman of HIP Investor. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time on ESGX.